Do you know how to describe small quantities or pieces in English? Well, today we're going to explore some fantastic vocabulary to help you do just that. First up, we have grain of sand. This term refers to a single tiny piece of sand. To give you an example, the desert is made up of billions of grains of sand. Next, we have blade of grass. This refers to an individual piece of grass. For instance, a single blade of grass was swaying in the wind. Following that, we have speck of dust. This describes an extremely small piece of dust. An example sentence would be, there was not a speck of dust in the immaculately clean room. Our fourth term is breath of fresh air. This phrase usually refers to something refreshing and new. For example, her innovative ideas were a breath of fresh air. Next is flake of snow. This term describes a single piece of snow. An example could be, each flake of snow is unique. Moving on, we have item of news. This refers to a single piece of news or information. For example, he shared an interesting item of news with us. Our seventh term is fragment of a vase. This refers to a broken piece of a vase. An example sentence would be, he carefully picked up each fragment of the broken vase. Next is trace of poison. This refers to a very small amount of poison. For instance, the police found a trace of poison in his drink. Our ninth term is droplet of water. This describes a very small amount of water. An example could be, a single droplet of water fell from the tap. Our 10th term is pinch of salt. This refers to a small amount of salt usually picked up between the thumb and forefinger. For example, she added a pinch of salt to the soup. Following that, we have dash of pepper. This describes a small amount of pepper. An example sentence would be, he sprinkled a dash of pepper on his eggs. Next, we have sliver of wood. This refers to a small, thin piece of wood. For example, he got a sliver of wood stuck in his finger. Our 14th term is shard of glass. This refers to a broken piece of glass. An example sentence could be, she stepped on a shard of glass. Following on, we have whiff of perfume. This describes a small amount of perfume, usually smelt rather than seen. For example, he caught a whiff of her perfume as she walked past. Our 16th term is thread of silk. This refers to a very thin piece of silk. For instance, she sewed the button on with a thread of silk. Next is drop of honey. This refers to a small amount of honey. An example could be, he added a drop of honey to his tea. Our 18th term is sip of tea. This describes a small amount of tea, usually one mouthful. An example sentence could be, she took a sip of her hot tea. Next, we have grain of rice. This refers to a single piece of rice. For example, he ate every last grain of rice. Our 20th term is grain of truth. This phrase usually refers to a small amount of truth in a statement or idea. An example sentence could be, there wasn't a grain of truth in his story. Next up, we have pebble of gravel. This refers to a small stone in gravel. For instance, she picked up a pebble of gravel and threw it into the pond. Our 22nd term is puff of smoke. This describes a small amount of smoke. An example could be, a puff of smoke came out of the chimney. Next, we have tinge of color. This refers to a small amount of color. For example, the leaves were starting to show a tinge of color. Our 24th term is dab of paint. This describes a small amount of paint. An example sentence could be, he added a dab of paint to the canvas. Next is snippet of conversation. This refers to a small part of a conversation. For instance, she caught a snippet of their conversation as she walked by. Our 26th term is glint of sunlight. This describes a small amount of sunlight, usually reflecting off something. An example could be, a glint of sunlight caught her eye. Finally, we have tad of information. This refers to a small amount of information. An example sentence would be, he gave us a tad of information about his plans. So, there you have it. 27 terms to describe small quantities or pieces in English. From a grain of sand to a tad of information, these expressions will enrich your vocabulary and help you express yourself more accurately.